On the Radar with the CBS 17 Storm Team.
Welcome back to On the Radar. This week, it's back to the solo show. So if you haven't gotten enough of me already, sorry, you're going to have to endure once again. I'm just kidding. We've got an exciting lineup of topics to talk about. We're going to talk about the tropics so far. Still have activity out there, and we still got a little bit of the season left to go. We're also going to take a look at nor'easters because we have one working up the East Coast as of the time of recording this. Of course, this is Friday, so we are looking at Friday, and let me get the date right here, October 10th. So should have known that. It's a special day in history for me. This is dating back to when Hurricane Michael made landfall in the panhandle of Florida. So something that always sticks with me on the 10th here. But we're talking about a nor'easter. So what is it? What does it do? And will this mean the Carolina Classic storm is back for the winter? We'll talk about that and what exactly that means. I'll have that as well. And we're going to look at a little bit of the fall foliage that is ongoing across North Carolina. And we're getting ready to get into some pretty awesome portions of that season. But we're going to start off right now with what's going on across the tropics. We've got plenty of activity out there. At the current moment, you still have Jerry that's out there. This isn't expected to become a hurricane. It's going to work into the central Atlantic. And then we also have Karen, which is a subtropical storm. It's that little spinning icon way up there in the northern latitudes of the middle of the Atlantic. So not all that common to see a tropical system that far north. This is subtropical, which means it's got characteristics of both. It's a little synoptic, it's a little non-synoptic. Basically, it is a warm core system that has isolated itself out, but it is shrouded by everything that is not tropical. So this is one of those blink and you miss it type of events out there in the middle of the Atlantic. And we've got the big dip in the jet stream on the eastern seaboard. You see that low next to Florida. That is start one on process of nor'easter or coastal low, something that's more typical as we get into the winter time setup and then works up the East Coast. So that's something you usually hear about in the Northeast, but that's not where the term nor'easter comes from. Again, we're going to talk more about that in just a little bit. So let's get to the hurricane season where we are. We're well past peak at this point in time. Typically about October 20th is the end of peak season. So going from August 20th to October 20th, that's when 90% of all of tropical activity occurs. And so we're getting close to wrapping that up here, and we're probably getting close to the end of the season overall. I know the season goes until the end of November, and you can have tropical systems going back to Hurricane Kate, which made landfall in the panhandle of Florida on Thanksgiving Day. That was in 1985. It was a Category 1. So tropical systems can happen really even into late season going through the tropics. But for us, we are starting to see signs that the tropics are winding down as far as that activity goes. And we should see the MJO, which is the Madden-Julian Oscillation, go into a phase which is suppressive. That just means air is sinking over the tropics, and that really doesn't allow for a whole lot of tropical activity once we get there. So that should work into that phase by the time we get toward the middle and end of the month. So we're at the 10th of October. By the time we get to about the 17th, 18th, 19th, we're probably winding down on tropical season. So about 2 more weeks of watching the tropics and then probably not talking about much in the tropics after that point in time. Again, the season goes until the end of November, so it's always wise to watch no matter what time of year it is. If we're talking tropics, of course, you want to be paying attention. But nothing to worry about out there at the moment. Jerry, unlikely to become a hurricane now. It's being sheared by an upper-level low off to the north. Where have you heard that before? Ding, ding, ding. Tropical season 2025. And this is going to curve off to the east of Bermuda, so really not a whole lot of impacts even here along the East Coast. We've got our bigger issues, which is the nor'easter that is going to be developing. And this will become a remnant low or an extra tropical system by the time we get into the middle of next week. It's, of course, by that point in time, we're going to be recording the next On the Radar and getting ready to roll out with that. And, of course, this season has had its surprises. Umberto, Aaron, and Gabrielle, all major storms. Karen, Jerry, Imelda, also being the other lone hurricane. So 4 hurricanes and 11 named storms. Like I said, Karen pulling the absolute Karen move there. Sorry, if your name is Karen. We're just talking about the meme, of course, that is way up there in the northern latitudes. Outside of that, not a whole lot going on, and thankfully for that as well. So you can look at the tropical season thus far, and it has been one of refreshment, because typically we are talking about threatening storms. Something that is typical is that we're going to see at least 1, 2, maybe 3 landfalls in the U.S. So far, the only issues to the U.S. from the tropical nature have come from basically remnant effects. Umberto, Aaron, Imelda, those were all remnant effects from those systems. Chantal, the only one actually making landfall in the U.S., and it started as an area of interest in the Gulf and then worked across and worked its way up into the Carolinas. So really, it only made one landfall there in South Carolina, and then everything else has been out over the Atlantic, and that's all thanks to the issues that we've had to deal with, which is that TUT that is working across the central Atlantic, the breaks in the subtropical ridge, which has been thanks to, well, the Rossby waves and the TUTs working across, breaking down that subtropical ridge, allowing for these systems to not track further off to the west, but turn off to the north. There's been a lot of scares for Bermuda. They had to deal with Imelda, and then they've had a lot of systems go around them, but that's been about it. Everything has basically behaved and stayed in the Atlantic. Again, we had the rapid intensification of Aaron, we had the rapid intensification of Umberto, same thing with Gabrielle, and thankfully none of those working their way toward the U.S. So hopefully as we go through the next couple of weeks, because again, I think we are winding down on this tropical season, we will likely see less activity out there. So what were we looking at preseason? Again, this was expected to be above average or slightly above average overall, 12 to 15. We're at 11. Colorado State went with 17. We're at 11. I don't think we're going to get to 17. And then NOAA, of course, also went 13 to 19. So I think 12 is possible. I think we might end up maybe we get to 13. Maybe there's 2 more name systems out there. Again, we're at 11 right now. Major hurricanes, we've hit that number of 2 to 3. That's the average of being 3. So we've had 3. Colorado State went 4, and then 3 to 5 on NOAA. And then the number of hurricanes, I think we're going to be way under the number of hurricanes, even on the average. The average is 7. We've had 4. Certainly don't see us seeing 3 more, especially since Jerry is not going to make it to hurricane status unless it pulls a fast one. But overall, I think we are talking about less than average activity across the basin, which is good news. It's just struggled with a lot of suppressive dry air, especially in peak season right at the middle of September, as well as early season. We saw a lot of that going on as well. So that's good news. Let's look back at Matthew. This is something I did not tease before, but I do want to talk about, because Hurricane Matthew and its near landfalls was something that just passed here, and that is the anniversary, not too long ago. So back in 2016, this worked up on the Atlantic side of Florida. It was a Category 5 in the Caribbean, and then it never made landfall. It skirted along the coastline 3 times. And remember, landfall is a perfect perpendicular dissection of the coast. So that means half of the center of the low pressure has to work on land. If it just has a portion of the center work on land, that is not technically a landfall. However, Matthew did a whole lot of destruction, even though it did not make landfall. And a lot of that had to do with decoupling of the center. So as it was approaching the South Carolina coastline and then eventually got the boot out into the Atlantic, you also had some shear in the mid-levels. So that helped to pull the mid-level and upper-level center off to the north, which dropped immense rainfall across right here in the triangle in central North Carolina. That's where we saw a lot of the big issues from Hurricane Matthew. It was the strongest storm of the 2016 season, and it caused significant flash flooding across North Carolina. 29 lives, unfortunately, were lost, and an estimated $1.5 billion in damage. On the lower end of scales from the tropical stuff that we've looked back in the past, its uniqueness being the fact that it did not make landfall, even though it got very close to the coastline in Florida, South Carolina, Georgia, and then again here in North Carolina, and still caused a whole lot of issues. So sometimes these systems don't necessarily need to make landfall rainfall to cause all of these issues. It can happen from a number of ways. And what are we talking about records-wise with Matthew? Well, it set one-day daily rainfall records across the area. Raleigh picked up 6.4 inches of rain in one day. The old record set back in June of 2006. Fayetteville, how about that? 14 inches of rain in just 24 hours time. That is incredible. Again, broke the old record set back. It was set back in September of 16. So that must have been, no, because Florence would have been in 2018. So Fayetteville crushing a new record at the same time. And then Tarboro at 9.5. The old record was way back when, set in 1872. So records are meant to fall for sure, and certainly that was the case with Matthew. So look back on a historic storm. And if you've been watching On the Radar, you'll remember that if you end up on the western side of the track, more than likely the issues you're going to be dealing with is that friction force stacking up against the land, stacking up with whatever trough is trying to work in or whatever trough may already be present. And with that, you are creating extra convergence. So you're worried about flooding. When you're on the west side of the track, most of the time it is flooding. It is considered to be the better side of the storm, only for the mere fact that you're not going to be dealing with the extreme winds and you likely have a reduced tornado risk. However, you are more than likely dealing with a flooding risk. Think back to Floyd. Think back to Matthew. Think back to Francis. It was in 2018, a couple of years after Matthew. Everybody was on the western side of Francis because of the track that it took. So all of those things, again, point back to when a tropical system is being forecasted for your area, to focus on the impacts for your area, not necessarily the category of the storm or where the exact track is going to go, because being on the western side, probably dealing with a flooding event. If you're on the eastern side, you might have to deal with the rain, but you're likely dealing with severe weather coming in the form of tropical tornadoes and even the possibility of extreme winds if the system is strong. So every system is unique. Every storm is unique. You always want to pay attention to those exact impacts to your area. So we're going to take a quick break right here, but when we come back, we're going to talk nor'easter setup. We have an example of that nor'easter that's getting ready to happen this coming weekend. Again, by the time you're watching this, if you're watching this next week, it will have already happened, but we're going to transition that into, will this be the classic winter setup that we see as we go into the season? And yes, I'm talking about the winter season. And does this mean a lot of snow is on the way? I'll have those details when we return.
On the Radar with the CBS 17 Storm Team.
Welcome back to On the Radar. This week, it's a healthy dose of meteorologist Ross Whitley here in the CBS 17 Plus headquarters. We are doing On the Radar this week. If you missed the first half here, we were talking about the tropics, the 2025 season so far, a look at the potential end of the season, because it's certainly where I think we are headed over the next couple of weeks. We're going to be wrapping things up, and then by the end of October, we're going to be in a suppressive phase of the MJO, which likely means that we are done with tropical activity. And then it's on to fall severe weather season. If you're unfamiliar with that, that's typically just the clash of air masses as summer tries to hang on and we get these big shots of cold air to come down. And we can get some pretty hefty synoptic lows to pull warm air off of the Gulf, off of the Atlantic, and those two can help to create the right setup for shear and rotation, which gives us, unfortunately, tornadic activity and even severe thunderstorms. Would even get into hail as we go through the fall season as well. So fall severe weather season, sometimes in the Carolina, it ends up being closer to December as opposed to being in the early fall months. But again, that's where we're likely headed, is in that direction here soon as we are entering cold front season. But speaking of cold front season, that typically comes with a dip in the jet stream, and the dip in the jet stream with a low pressure system already there, that is helping to create the classic setup for a nor'easter. So what is a nor'easter? Well, typically it's an area of low pressure that either gets going on the Atlantic side of Florida, sometimes it gets going on the Gulf side, transfers across, and then works up the East Coast following that jet stream. High pressure is usually in control across the Ohio River Valley or back up into the Great Lakes. This helps to drive cooler, drier air on the west side. So that leads to a tight gradient of rain that is working up the East Coast. Depending on where that low exactly tracks, how close it is to land, if it tracks over land, will really depend on how far west that moisture does make it. But overall, we all deal with a northeast wind. And that is where the term nor'easter comes from. So it's no fancy type of definition for a coastal low. It's just you're getting a northeast wind, so it's a nor'easter. And that's exactly what we have for the setup going forward is that's going to continue to help to grab that cooler air, pull it down out of the northeast, keep that northeast wind all up and down the East Coast, even as the low tracks further off to the north. We're still holding onto that northeast wind. And it's also aided by that high pressure system further off to the west. So in the winter, when that high pressure system is driving in cold, dry air, this can typically lead to the biggest snow setups for coastal areas on the East Coast. So going to Washington, D.C., back up I-90, going all the way up into New Jersey and New York, and even up into Connecticut, Massachusetts. That's where we see these big time snowstorms in the winter. The last several years, we haven't had a whole lot of nor'easters. We haven't had a whole lot of coastal lows running up the coast. They've pretty much been getting the boot kicked out to sea, basically by the time they start to work up the coast, and then they're gone. So that's led to a lot of dry air whenever cold air is around, and whenever cold air isn't around, it's allowed for it to just be warm, wet rain over the last several winters. Now, we did have a snowstorm last year that worked really far off of the coast, and that helped to give some surprise snows to coastal areas like the Panhandle of Florida, as well as going to South Carolina, coastal areas in North Carolina, Wilmington, and then late season, we had one heck of a snowstorm for Norfolk, and then Virginia Beach. That was toward the end of the winter season last year. So why is this not a tropical system? Well, it's being aided by the dip in the jet stream, which means it's got some influences that are going on aloft, as well as it not being a typical closed warm core system. So a tropical system is entirely warm core, which means from its center all the way out, that is a warm dynamics. Our typical synoptic systems that happen in the winter, they happen from baroclinic. So what that means is the temperature differences across land or across water. So the Gulf Stream, for inference for us, is not that far offshore. It is very warm water, but you have cooler water on both sides of that Gulf Stream. So a lot of times low pressure systems will start to develop over the Gulf Stream, and they'll be aided by not only cooler air coming in from a cold front or a trough, but they'll also be aided by the water temperature differences over a very tight gradient. And that tight gradient allows for the system to strengthen. So system strengthening on baroclinicity, or the temperature differences, that's typically our synoptic cold fronts that work in, are our big synoptic lows. However, tropical systems, they are an entirely warm core. So they're dependent on warm water, low friction, and high pressure aloft. That's why when a tropical system works on land, it dissipates, because it's working away from the dynamics that created the low in the first place. Sometimes they transition, or they get aided by the atmosphere. They'll run into a jet streak or a jet stream, and they'll intensify and they'll work on land, or they'll get a boost from that, or they'll just lend their moisture to some other system that is working in the mid and upper levels. But for the most part, a tropical system is at the surface, and everything else that we deal with in weather is working off of the surface. So using the surface temperature differences to create its overall energy. Not the case with a nor'easter. You get a kind of combination of both. It's asymmetrical, which means it's lopsided, and typically lopsided on the north, northwest side, and northeast side, with dry air wrapping around on the south side and southeast side. So that's why you see all the moisture, and in the winter when we get these big snow setups. So for us this time, as we're watching this nor'easter develop and then work across our area, it's going to be throwing moisture in that typical typical fashion off of the coast, back across the Carolinas, and then working up into the Northeast. So if you missed that, we'll go back forward. So there's the typical tropical, or rather the typical nor'easter track here, working up into the Northeast. And what are we getting ready to see? Well, we're getting ready to see the same type of thing. Low pressure system working up the coast, throwing moisture back. Notice how it's dry on the south side of the low pressure system and dry on the east side of the low pressure system, and we get all that shower activity. And what did I mention that this typically does? It typically creates a very tight gradient of far as moisture goes. So where's the low of the track going? It's going pretty close to the coast, and we're expecting to see about an inch of rain across the most of the Raleigh-Durham area. So all of our counties from Virginia down into southeastern portions of North Carolina. So as you get closer to Fayetteville, Clinton, and then working down toward Wilmington, probably talking about 1 to 2 inches of rain there. Further off to the west, probably up to 1 inch of rain. And then as you get over into the Piedmont, we're talking about less than 1 inch of rain, more on the dry side. And right along the coast, 2 to 4 inches of rain, certainly a possibility. And again, that takes us back to the classic Carolina winter setup. So this is the classic Carolina winter setup. If you want snow in our area over the winter, you're rooting for a system just like what we're getting ready to see. Or if you're watching this in the future, just like a system we just had, where colder air is being dragged down. You've got a low running up the coast, preferably off the coast, so we don't get any kind of mixing, because you can see if the low works closer to the coast, then we get mixing. That just means warm air in the mid-levels that helps to bring that warm air in. You get a mix of rain, sleet, or snow. If it's cold at the surface, you might even get freezing rain. And then there's the other setup that happens, and this is the setup that we all hate, but thanks to the topography, that being the Appalachian Mountains, if we get a low pressure system that works off to the west and you have cold air wedged in by a very strong high pressure system over Canada, over the Great Lakes, or over the Northeast, then that colder air can be wedged in shallowly at the surface. And if that's the case, then we're talking sleet or freezing rain. You might get a little bit of snow to mix in if it's an upper level low and we can help pull down that colder air from aloft and it works directly over the top of us. But this is typically the two scenarios that we end up seeing as far as our winter weather setup. So does an early nor'easter actually point to a snowy winter for us? Well, we'll all just have to wait and see together. I would willing to bet that the correlation is probably 0, but patterns do tend to repeat themselves. So patterns that show up early can sometimes show up repetitively and continue to do so. So if you want that classic winter setup, hope that we see some more nor'easters or coastal lows over the coming weeks. Possibly maybe just hope for it to happen when we have cold air around, and certainly not these Miller B-type systems that work up the west side of the Appalachian Mountains with cold air already in place, because nobody wants to deal with sleet or freezing rain. How about the fall colors? Because we do have some reports of the leaves changing out there, and we're nearing peak along the higher elevations, and in the highest elevations of the Black Mountain Range, going back over to the Highlands and then out into the Smokies, we're starting to hit peak at this point in time, which is typical. As we get into early October, into the middle of October, that's when we usually see peak across the mountains. And then by the time you get to the end of October, the lower elevations start to get into that near peak, partial peak, and peak range. And by the beginning of September, or rather the beginning of November, that's when we see the lowest elevations, seeing all of that fall foliage as well. So what do we have out there? Last week we meant to show you, Rachel and I, this one, the Forrest Gump curve there on Grandfather Mountain, and we do have a little bit of that fall color showing up there. That's a beautiful shot. We also have some pictures from Beech Mountain across the lake there, and we're starting to see those reds show up as well, and the drier conditions helping to pop some of these colors, and the cooler conditions add nice. Again, this one for coming from the backside of Beech Mountain, some nice fall foliage really showing up there, and you can see that there across the leaves as well. So that red, yellow, all starting to show up quite nicely for us. And again, just just to finish with this one back from Grandfather Mountain, I think this is one of my favorite pictures from last week, seeing not only the colors but also still the late season flowers still blooming, some of the berries still on the bushes. We haven't had the bears get to them just yet, and that is it. How about we talk about what impacts that fall color, because it has been really dry, and dry conditions sometimes can hurt your fall color depending on how bad the drought is. More sunshine, the more vibrant the colors typically are, so that's good news on the dry side. However, the cool morning and warm afternoons, that's really what you're looking for to help preserve those leaves to stay on there longer. But if you end up in drought conditions or you stay dry too long, that can keep the color from really showing up. And then we get a system like what we're getting ready to have that's going to be breezy, bring us a lot of wind and gusty conditions that typically is unfortunately going to cause not what we want. That causes browning on the leaves pretty quickly, or it starts to pull down that foliage altogether. So hopefully, as we get into peak season here over the next couple of weeks, we are talking about seeing wonderful color out there. That is the hope. And if you would like to send us your pictures, please do so. You can send those pictures to any of us on the weather team, and we will likely start to feature them on the radar here, or you might even see them on air as well. So make sure to check in on that. But again, just to wrap things up here, we just had the anniversary of Hurricane Matthew, and that was one of the more significant flooding events of the 2016 and really a lot of the past tropical seasons, excluding maybe Florence across our area, and then Floyd as well. Those are probably two events that still outmatch what Matthew did, but Matthew was still a very memorable storm. We are talking nor'easter, which if you learned anything, and this is where the section of the video where the teacher says, "What did you learn today?" If you learned anything out of a nor'easter, it should be that it is called that because you get a northeast wind. That is it. That is nothing else to it. It's just a northeast wind. You should also have learned that nor'easter, not tropical. It's asymmetrical warm core, which means it's got fronts. It's getting a little aid from baroclinicity, which means temperature differences, as well as those synoptic scale features. So the dip in the jet stream helping to create that low pressure system. So not a tropical system. And lastly, if you want snow this winter, root for more nor'easters, especially like this one, to develop on the Atlantic side of Florida, hug the coast, throw that moisture back when cold air is present. That is a great snow setup for us. So hopefully, if you're a winter weather lover, this guy, if you are a winter weather lover, hopefully that is what we are talking about as we go through the winter season. If you're not, well, you can just boo me through the screen. But overall, I'm hoping that we get those kinds of setups. And if we're going to have winter weather, it might as well be snow, not freezing rain and sleet, which is the other setup. So that's what we went through. That is this week's On the Radar. Make sure you can check us every week. You can catch up on the website as well as on Roku Plus, that CBS 17 Plus app on Roku. That's where you're going to find these featured the most. But again, you can check it out on the website as well. And that's CBS17.com.